Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, صباح الخير, مساء الخير, buenas tardes, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our open classroom, Whose Narratives, 20 years since 9/11, 2001. We begin, as always, with land acknowledgement that the campuses of San Francisco State University on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay are located within the occupied territories of the Ramaytush, Ohlone, and the coastal Miwok, who, along with the Southern Pomo, are organized as the Federal Indians of Greater Rancheria. On the East Coast, where I am now, we are on the land of the displaced and dispossessed Lenape people. I would like to ask everybody to stop for a moment of silence to honor all those fallens, beginning from the moment we're in, with the 3,000 people who died on September 11, 2001, 20 years ago. And we depart from the US-centric approach by remembering and thinking of all those who have fallen around the world as a direct result of US interventionist and imperialist wars and European colonialism and settler colonialism and genocidal wars against the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved, victims of manifest destiny, Chinese exclusion, the limited quotas against those escaping the horrors of Nazism and fascism, the Palmer raids and the targeting and deportation of communists, anarchists, and any opponents of US wars of aggression and greed, and disaster capitalism and racial capitalism, those constructed as enemy alien and incarcerated, such as the Japanese community in internment camps, threatened those who are threatened by similar camps and incarceration, such as the LA8, due to the so-called secret enemy aliens and undesirables, a contingency plan that was devised by the Vice President of the United States, George Herbert Bush, during the Reagan administration, while covering up for the Iran-Contra affairs. The current day prisoners of war, POW, held in Guantanamo Bay, or the inherent feature of the settler colonial security state that targets, assassinates, and criminalizes in order to eliminate the leadership of anti-colonial and anti-racist movements and movements for justice, from Contilpro to Albizo campus, whose tomorrow marks the anniversary of his assassination, the Puerto Rican movement, to Patrice Lumumba, Salvador Allende. Today is also the anniversary of September 11, 1973, of the coup d'etat by Pinochet and the CIA against the elected government of Chile, to Palestinian leaders and militants, the use of secret evidence, and I would also be remiss if I do not mention the 6 Palestinian prisoners who exposed Israeli prison and security state, 4 of whom who have been captured now, and people are very concerned about their fate and what is going to happen to them in prison, along with the thousands of Palestinian prisoners. This also brings to mind the Jenin camp massacre in April 2001, a few months before 9/11 2001, or the Durban Conference Against War on Racism that took place 3 weeks before, and that was also a platform to organize against racism, war, and apartheid, inspired by the South African movement against settler colonialism, against apartheid, and against all sorts of inequalities. I am mentioning these developments and events to highlight why we use the title of Whose Narratives and focus on challenging different narratives. The objective is to challenge conventional wisdom within the academy and the official and public discourses. We would like to place the events of 9/11 2001, i.e. the US events of 9/11 2001, in their historical context, in order to critically think through US hegemonic discourses that define this particular event as a unique and exceptional watershed, which also revolves around and builds upon the US and Israeli exceptionalism, legitimizes imperialist wars and interventions, including the so-called war on terror, justify the securitized state with its increased surveillance and profiling, incarceration, torture, rendition, and assassination, and promotes hypermasculinity and a colonial, gendered, and sexualized violent order of modernity and civilization, and as a result, invisibilizes the majority of the people of the population, let's say 99% against the 1%. We are indeed fortunate to have the amazing renowned historian of the people, Professor Robin Kelley, who offered to moderate this historic event. We are also so fortunate that such an amazing list of participants have agreed, taking time away from their busy schedule to come and join us. As such, today's inaugural roundtable kicks off a semester-long intergenerational conversation series. The series brings together youth and students within and outside the formal classroom, some of whom were born around 2001 or even after, with US and internationally based scholars, organic intellectuals, and movement leaders. The virtual event is part of two projects, Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical Praxis, and the Indivisibility of Justice. Many of us have also participated in many conferences or in open classroom series and virtual discussions, and the Ahmed Open Classroom series. The three classes that we are bringing today is the Edward Said course, Gender and Modernity in Arab and Muslim Communities, and Comparative Border Studies, Palestine and Mexico. A few other classrooms were supposed to be part of this event, including one of our core courses, Civil Liberties of Arabs and Muslims post 9/11/2001. It's actually the only course offered at SFSU that specifically speaks to and tries to understand and critically analyze what happened 20 years ago and its aftermath. The course is one of only two required courses for the Ahmed minor. The other one was canceled in the summer, and thus we do not have any minor requirements at this point, and i.e. no students can minor actually in Ahmed. It fulfills several GE requirements such as social justice, global perspectives, and American ethnic and minority relations, as well as upper decision in several places. Other courses were canceled, and I'm just going to list them. The Palestinian mural and the art of resistance, the Arab and Arab American post-colonial identity, the national racialization, national security and the racialization of Arabs and Muslims. And also we requested introduction to ethnic studies from Ahmed-centered perspectives. These have been canceled. I want to also, before I turn it over to my colleague, Robin, I wanted to thank the list of the co-organizers and co-sponsors. The co-organizers, as I mentioned, is the Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies Program and the People's Forum that has been so nice as to offer us a refuge platform in view of the Facebook shutdown of the Ahmed page and the silencing following Zoom, YouTube, and other platforms, private media platforms silencing of us last September 2023. The event was also titled Whose Narratives? And April 23, another event that was called also Whose Narratives, focusing on academic freedom. The co-sponsors include American Muslims for Palestine, Armed Forces, Center for Islam and Global Affairs, Center for Security, Race and Rights at Rutgers University, CUNY for Palestine, Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project, Islamophobia Studies Journal, Jewish Voice for Peace, Bay Area Chapter, Jewish Force for Peace, New York City, and Palestinian Youth Movement, Releasing Aging People in Prison, RAP, and the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. So this inaugural event and the series that we are hoping to continue, provided we do not experience any more disasters, are both a labor of love and an attempt to not leave any stone unturned, thinking because there are no limits to the mind and to our questioning and asking what's going on, how do we explain the world, and how do we go about changing it. I also want to, last but not least, thank the people who made this possible. Daisy Diamond, who created the flyer, and before it was Sarah Sills who was creating the flyers, both anti-Zionist members of the Jewish Voice for Peace. Hidayah Anaya, who created the flyer in both Arabic and English. Jade Musa, who edited the speakers' bios. Hidayah and Layth Ghulum, They did the social media with the help of many groups and co-sponsors, including in our academic and community partners. Elayan Fulayhan and David Shink from the People's Forum. And last but not least, my colleague, friend, and collaborating partner in Teaching Palestine and other Ahmed projects, Salim Shhade. I now turn the mic over to my longtime comrade and friend. We met actually almost 20 years ago, Professor Robin DJ Kelley, and who will be giving opening remarks and actively moderate this panel. And I believe Robin at one point has to catch a flight, at which point we will continue with my moderation. So I'm going to turn it over. There will be 3 panels, rounds of discussions, 2 to 3 minutes each person, and then we will open it up for discussion. And then this is only the beginning, and we are hoping to also publish the proceedings. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Robin.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabab. I mean, we were both at NYU at the time of 9/11. Of course, let me just make a few quick remarks. 9/11, as we all know, doesn't begin on 9/11. It precedes the Bush Doctrine of preemptive war. It precedes the Reagan-era proxy wars. It precedes the Cold War operations that overthrew any regimes that might threaten U.S. hegemony. It's before the Nakba, before the creation of Israel, before going back really to the birth of the colonial order. And of course, 9/11 marks a certain kind of turning point, which our panelists will discuss, but it's also a manifestation of US empire and the racism that undergirds it. And the lessons I think every generation learns is that US empire threatens the future of humanity. 20 years ago, in every talk or piece I published having to do with this moment, I always quoted Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great scholar and activist, from his autobiography, whose words were prescient then and they're prescient now. He says, today we are lying, stealing, and killing. He's talking about the United States. We call all this by finer names: advertising, free enterprise, and national defense. But names in the end deceive no one. Today we use science to help us deceive our fellows. We take wealth that we never earned, and we are devoting all our energies to kill, maim, and drive insane men, women, and children who dare refuse to do what we want done. No nation threatens us. We threaten the world. So to help us think through these issues of the meaning of 9/11, we have an amazing, very large panel. You can read their bios in the chat, I believe, and they're extensive, but I'm going to give very, very brief descriptions of who these folks are. Many of them need no introduction. But we have Deepa Kumar, professor of media studies at Rutgers University, where she's affiliated with Women and Gender Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, the Center for Race and Ethnicity. And this year, she released a revised edition of her book, Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, 20 years since 9/11. After that, we'll hear from Hatem Banian, who's the co-founder of Zaytuna College and professor of Islamic law and theology there. He's also a lecturer in the departments of Near Eastern Studies and Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And then Jasmin Zine, a professor of sociology and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's a faculty member in the Critical Muslim Studies Institute in Granada and the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley. And then we'll hear from the great revolutionary Ronnie Kasrils, who was a member of the ANC's armed wing in South Africa from its inception in 1961 and went on to become chief on military intelligence, and following liberation, held several ministerial portfolios in the democratic government between 1994 and 2008. He is a political activist and a prominent figure in South Africa's Palestine Solidarity Movement. Then we'll hear from Dr. Rania Masri, who's a faculty member at Lebanese American University, and for the past 6 years has been a member of the Lebanese political party Citizens in a State. Her writings have centered on issues dealing with human rights, environmental justice, and she has also written and organized against the sanctions on Iraq and the occupation of all of Palestine. And then we'll hear from Fahd Ahmed, who is the executive director of DRUM, that's Desi's Rising Up and Moving. A grassroots organization has been around for 21 years. Within Drum, Fahd co-led the work with Muslim, Arab, and South Asian immigrant detainees before and immediately after 9/11 by coordinating the detainee visitation program. Then we'll hear from Sami Al-Arian, who is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and Public Affairs professor at Istanbul at Sabahattin Zaim University. In 2012, he was profiled by historians of the Encyclopedia of American Dissidents as one of only 3 Muslims in the US who was a prisoner of conscience in the past century, which included people like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Then we'll hear from Lisa Hajjar, professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is founding co-editor of Jaliyah and a member of the editorial committee of Middle East Report. Her new book, The War in Court, The Inside Story of the Fight Against US Torture in the War on Terror, will be published by the University of California Press, so look out for that. Then we'll hear from Yazan За3за3, who's a community-based researcher and organizer at Vigilant Love in Los Angeles, and a longtime member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. Their research examines the relationship between war, migration, surveillance, and social welfare programming, including countering violent extremism. And finally, we'll hear from the person who pulled us all together, Professor Rabab Abdulhadi, who is the founding director and senior scholar of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies program, also associate professor of ethnic studies and affiliated faculty in sexuality studies at San Francisco State University. She's currently working on critical oral histories of Palestinian activism and editing a volume on Teaching Palestine, a project that challenges colonial narratives on Palestine and calls for decolonizing of the curriculum and ending the erasure of Palestine through education. So after that, so we're going to hear the first round, which is each member of the panel will address the question, what is your relationship or approach to 9/11? What was it 20 years ago? And where are you now? How do we define or see 9/11 at the moment? And we're going to go in the order that I laid out, which we're going to begin with Deepa.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you to Rabab for inviting me. Thank you to the organizers of this event. It's such an honor and privilege to be part of such an amazing panel of scholars and activists. So I want to share a few thoughts on how 9/11, as Robin mentioned, was a turning point in at least 2 ways. First, it strengthened and consolidated US imperialism. Second, it strengthened the domestic national security state. And of course, it is artificial to separate the domestic and international because practices used abroad come back home to be applied in the US and vice versa. So first on US imperialism, a little context. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US no longer had an overarching enemy against whom hot and cold wars could be waged. However, pockets of the ruling elite, particularly the neoconservatives, began to write about Islamic fundamentalism as a potential key threat to US global interests. The Israeli political class also tried to win the US and Europe to viewing the parties of political Islam as their new larger-than-life enemy to replace the Soviet Union. Now, the key ideologue leading this charge that the US needed to confront and challenge this adversary in what he called a clash of civilizations was Samuel Huntington. While Bernard Lewis had coined the term clash of civilizations, it was Huntington who popularized it in an essay in the journal Foreign Affairs with the question mark, the clash of civilizations, and then a book minus the question mark. In essence, Huntington put forward the thesis that in the new post-Cold War era, conflict would be characterized by cultural differences between various civilizations. He named about 7 or 8 such civilizations, arguing that the Islamic, but also the Chinese civilization were among the most dangerous threats to the West. Now, a report prepared in the early 1990s for the Pentagon by neocon Paul Wolfowitz at the request of Dick Cheney and a bunch of other neocons, titled Defense Planning Guidance Report, argued that the US's first objective in this new post-Cold War world should be to, quote, prevent the reemergence of a new rival, end quote. It must, the report went on to say, quote, establish and protect a new order so that potential competitors would realize that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. In short, a Pax Americana, they argued, should be established on the military, political, and economic fronts. Now, this was actually meant to be a confidential report, but it was leaked to the press, and it was very embarrassing for the authors. The political establishment as a whole denounced it. In fact, Joe Biden called it a prescription literally for a Pax Americana, an American empire. So that was not yet the neocons' time. The 1990s was still the era of humanitarian imperialism led by Bill Clinton and the liberal imperialists in tow. But 9/11 created a bipartisan consensus around this issue, unleashing Pax Americana and strengthening US empire. Since then, and despite the failed occupations in Iraq and most recently Afghanistan, the US has actually expanded its tentacles and its reach around the world, for instance, by establishing between 800 and 1,000 military bases around the world. And it is from some of these bases that drone strikes are conducted. And make no mistake about it, drone strikes, special operations forces are going to continue to be used and will probably become the key mode of imperial dominance, even while there's a pivot to Asia. But the result globally for people in the Middle East, North Africa, Central and South Asia is not a war on terror, but a war of terror. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were exposed to what carceral state scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called a vulnerability to premature death. While Gilmore is talking about Black and brown people targeted by the carceral state in the US, we might productively apply this definition in the global context as well in order to discuss the lives that are lost, the people who have died, who became collateral damage. Domestically, a range of programs were either introduced or strengthened to police the racial Muslim. These include, for instance, intrusive surveillance. Arun Kundanani has compared the surveillance of Muslims to that endured by East Germans under the Stasi, one of the most repressive intelligence and secret police agencies to have ever existed. Also, Muslims have been registered, detained, deported, tortured through measures like solitary confinement, entrapped, and so forth. I'll say very quickly, the FBI's entrapment program sends informants into communities to trap typically poor working class men who suffer from mental disabilities into carrying out acts they otherwise would not. And the logic behind all of this, it's called preemptive prosecution. It's based on the idea that all Muslims are potential terrorists. And so why not go in and lock them up and entrap them before they can do anything? Now, all of this relies on a deeply racist view of Muslims that combines cultural racism with biological racism. And I'll come to a close with this. It is not enough, I think, to point to deaths abroad, as well as disability and the ways in which people have been injured abroad and their life made unacceptable, and the violation of civil liberties at home, but to name what has gone on in the last 20 years for what it is, which is imperial racism. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Hatem is next. And also, can everyone make sure that they're muted? It just helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. And thanks, Robin and Rabab, for getting us to discuss this really important, critical subject at this 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I'm saying this while simultaneously contending with the marker of history that using 9/11 as a marker of history pre and post erases the markers of history across the globe. And one aspect of thinking about who gets to be recognized, who gets to be commemorated, and whose history gets to be centered is part and parcel of the critical discussions that we need to have. I'm happy that Deepa began with Huntington Clash of Civilization, making popular Bernard Lewis's thesis of the Clash of Civilization, because we are still contending with this framing of world politics by Cold War warriors that went into the closet and rechanged their outfit from a period from the early 20th century all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and picked up the green flag, Islam as a new packaged threat through which they could still construct their imaginary imperial project that could be unleashed and have a new lease of life. Huntington, in particular, on page 20 of his Clash of Civilization, I think is just one of the most profound statements that should be constantly engaged with. He says, quote, "There can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are." Which basically Huntington is framing that the Western world, in essence, is searching for an object of hate in order for it to arrive at self-love. And I know that every once in a while they make the claim that they are a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I'll leave the Judeo part, but the Christian tradition. And my understanding and my relations with the Eastern Christian community, especially in Palestine, at least one understand that Christianity and Jesus is the theology of love. So what Huntington and his ilk that are prescribing to this idea are putting Christianity and its theology on its head. Now, we could understand Western Christianity practices in terms of giving the cover for colonialism, settler colonialism, genocide. That, while we are understanding and documenting this, it is really to see the complete clarity of this imperial language that is couched in seeking an enemy in order to provide and consolidate an understanding of empire and imperial conquest. 9/11, without making it as the only marker of history, really unleashes Islamophobia on a writ large. It becomes the operable funnel through which foreign policy as well as domestic policies are shaped. Even though we could speak that the United States and its allies, whether it's in Western Europe and other places, have been engaged in massive human rights violation. And for us who were involved in the Latin American Solidarity Movement, or even speaking about the anti-apartheid movement, where the United States actually was the last to jump on the train of the anti-apartheid movement after it already was about to enter into the arrival station. And I'm reminded of the Reagan administration insisting on what's called constructive engagement with South Africa as a way to try to oppose at the time the sanctions movement that we were rallying around and getting it to be supported. So Islamophobia begins to be using Muslim subjectivity and the targeting of the Muslim subject in order to get a new lease on life for US empire and its allies across the world. And the world system gets to be rewired around the identity and the identification of the Muslim subject, which unleashes the invasion of Afghanistan, to be followed by the invasion of Iraq, and then subsequently unleashing also some of the most draconian measures. We're still speaking of individuals that are in Guantanamo Bay today, have not yet faced their day in court. And in here, I put the day in court in parentheses because these are military court proceedings that's unprecedented. This is law outside of law and law outside of actually history itself. And in addition, we could speak about the torture regime that was put in practice. I'm always reminded that Rabab's work at San Francisco State, that she's always attacked for just wanting to do history and wanting to actually challenge the normative practices of empire and also the Israeli policies. I'm reminded that at UC Berkeley, the professor who wrote the memos to authorize the expansion of torture regime in the United States is still a tenured professor, is still teaching at the law school, even though one could argue, and I would insist, that his authoring of the torture memos disqualifying him from teaching law, let alone being a full tenured professor at a preeminent law school, teaching students of the scope and the prerogative of executive authority. So Islamophobia begins to be the instrument of rewiring the world system. So it's not surprising to see that from Modi in India using Hindutva to target Muslims, Marine Le Pen in France, as well as Macron and the center right and left within France using Islamophobia, Boris Johnson in the UK using Islamophobia and really to push Brexit on the back of the demonization of the Muslim subject. The Netherlands, the same thing, Austria, and the systematic target, and also Muslim majority countries that likewise take on Islamophobia themselves to try to craft what's called who's good Muslim. And the good Muslim is the one that hugs the United States, that embraces everything of imperial power, that prescribes to the imitative project in all its particulars and totalities, and begin to push this framing. And the bad Muslim, in essence, speaking of the book, The Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, anyone that opposes US empire or the local manifestation of it in the Arab and Muslim world likewise become cast as an outsider in this process. Needs to be demonized, targeted, arrested, tortured, and really railroaded on en masse. And this gets us into that post 9/11 have witnessed the destruction of Arab and Muslim countries, as well as individual lives and families. And Palestine, again, not to go specifically, Palestine itself lives this on a daily basis, and if anything, is a continuity. But lastly, 9/11 as a rewiring of the US imperial system does the following, that the United States today have military operations in one way or other on 39% of the world's surface. It has ongoing drone operations in 7 countries. It has established military bases. Deepa have mentioned this, almost in 1,000 different types of bases, from large to small, and 44 countries that the United States has its footprint on, which includes the setting up of the Africa Central Command, which did not exist prior to 9/11. So you could also see the reintroduction and the re-emergence of Africa being a site of contestation, and that gets us into the clash of civilization, the Sino-Islamic threat that Huntington and Lewis earlier spoke about is being shaped around these policies. So 9/11 as a rewiring of the world system needs to be understood, and how to actually bring about nods of resistance by first understanding and then mobilizing the needed intellectual as well as activist energies to challenge this new world system centered on the subjectivity and demonization of the Muslim subject in order to drive policy. I would say always that Islamophobia is not about the Muslim, it's about the Western power structure using the Muslim as the subject in order to drive this imperial policy and centered with military-industrial complex in the front part or the front power dynamics of it. So I hope we'll have some questions, but thanks for this conversation for us to begin.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm looking at the time. Jasmin is next. It's like, you know, all of us activists, academics are like preachers. You say 2 to 3 minutes and you take 10. So what we're going to end up doing is probably just one round. And so I want to give people the opportunity to be able to share some of the critical issues you want to bring up. And then we're going to open up to ask each other questions, just so we don't lose time. So Jasmin is next.
Thank you so much. And greetings from Canada. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit here on Turtle Island. And I wanted to begin by acknowledging the colonial theft and violence upon which this nation was built, and to honor the Indigenous history and struggles that persist amidst this imperial legacy. And I think that's important because we are talking about the imperial legacies of the present. And I think one of the imperialist legacies, of the so-called war on terror that we've learned is that the politics of empire has become a lived experience and not just a geopolitical construct. I explore this theme through my forthcoming book, which is called Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. And I think one of my interests has been in looking at how 9/11, its aftermath, the heightened Islamophobia, the draconian security policies that affected many countries across the world, not just the United States, and this global war on terror, how has it affected this generation of Muslim youth that are being socialized within these conditions, within that landscape of violence that they've inherited, and how are they constructing their identities in light of those conditions? And considering that they did not know a world before that time, and that, you know, this has become a new normal for them. And so in looking at that project, you know, I interviewed 130 Muslim youth across Canada to talk about the issues that have faced them as the 9/11 generation, who've grown up under these unique circumstances and have been in a place where their identities have been reconfigured as radicals, as jihadists, and serving as an iconic foil to make the Western imperial project seem intelligible, reasonable, and just. And that's impacted their sense of identity, citizenship, and belonging in the nation, and rendered them as suspect subjects that are targeted by the security industrial complex and the CVE industry. And these kinds of conditions create what I refer to as the affective registers of Islamophobia in the form of what I call an imperial habitus. I'm drawing on Bourdieu's notion of the way that individuals perceive and react to the social worlds in which they inhabit. And this affective conditioning occurs through what Rachel Payne has referred to as an emotional geopolitics that acknowledges the feelings, perceptions, views, subjectivities, and bodies who experience the outcome of geopolitical decisions and processes firsthand and through their everyday lives. Now, I can remember even in my own experience, thinking back to that day of 9/11 20 years ago, being here in Canada, watching the Twin Towers falling on the TV and thinking to myself, you know, which I think a lot of Muslims everywhere were thinking, please don't let this be a Muslim responsible for this attack, because we knew that it wouldn't just be those individuals who were responsible that would be held accountable, but Muslims around the world would pay a price, and there would be a collective guilt and burden of a responsibility as a result. And so, this is a reality that, at the time I had to go and pick up my kids from Islamic school that day. And even prior to 9/11, if there was anything happening in the world that, Muslims were involved with, there would be bomb threats at the school. And so we were very concerned about, especially that day, even before we knew who was responsible. And by the time we got to the Islamic school, which was part of a mosque, to go pick up our kids, the men in the community had formed a security perimeter, linked arms around to protect the physical space of the mosque and school. And that became a sign of the times, that despite, the conditions that led to the situation of 9/11, which my colleagues have articulated well in the political formations of that, Muslims were going to be held to account. At the time, I used to wear the hijab, and so I was visibly, more visibly Muslim. And I didn't leave my house for about a week because there had been a surge in hate crimes against Muslims, particularly Muslim women. And so looking back on that period of time, again, as a lived experience, not just a geopolitical construct, there are other ways in which Islamophobia, the context of post 9/11 Islamophobia, has affected Muslim communities. And I'll just mention three. One, Islamophobia as a state of exception. And I'm thinking here of Giorgio Agamben's work, and when he refers to the suspension of the rule of law at times of emergency as a state of exception, and how these conditions that are normally introduced under limited and extraordinary circumstances have become normalized and serve as the dominant paradigm of government in contemporary politics. Now, these techniques of governance form a discursive function that transforms peaceful citizens into outlaws overnight, and that was what the communities in the post 9/11 context experienced. And this is when we started to see the political and ideological categories of the radical, the jihadist, that became coded into an index of suspicion that informed the practices of racial and religious profiling that we see continuing to this day. And so these deviant identities become interpolated into discourses of a security industrial complex as the apparatus through which post 9/11 governmentality and exceptionalism operate. These processes of sorting and creating topologies of abject differences are part of the new racial and cultural eugenic practices that are governing national borders. The second theme I want to draw on are the folk devils. The idea that Stanley Cohen put forward back in the 70s, this conception of social deviance where folk devils operate as scapegoats and are blamed for a variety of social problems. Now, if we look at the Islamophobia industry, which is another post 9/11 manifestation, whether in the United States or in Canada, we can see, for example, that it's been fueled by campaigns of misinformation, deceit, and salacious lies about Muslims as the fifth column, the Islamic Trojan horse that seeks to overthrow Western civilization, the Islamist boogeyman. And these discourses are purveyed and popularized through mainstream media as well as far-right social media in ways that create moral panics. And those moral panics normalize and heighten Islamophobia and result in hate crimes and backlash. So this Muslim folk devil archetype plays a key role in post 9/11 security discourses, policies, practices as an emblem of deviance and risk. And the third thing that I wanted to speak to was also about liberal Islamophobia and the ways in which in countries like Canada that profess multiculturalism and a kind of Islamophilia or celebration of differences in the Muslim presence at the same time, have this imperialist sort of, this impulse of fetishistic fascination with the exotic otherness of Muslims and at the same time a racial disavowal. And that is what actually shapes the politics of multiculturalism. And so at the same time, these states are, celebrating diversity and then enacting policies that are targeting Muslims. And so, like the United States, Canada has security policies that involve things like secret trials and secret evidence, anti-terror laws that address pre-crime, the no-fly list where Muslim toddlers have found their names on, and other systems of surveillance of Muslim organizations and charities and so on. But this kind of liberal Islamophobia also affects the final note I want to say, which is the gendered forms of Islamophobia. And so how has gender played into the war on terror and the ensuing Islamophobia? And so I'm thinking of policies in Quebec here in Canada or in France that are regulating Muslim women's bodies through what I call forms of sartorial nationalism. So policies that prohibit the religious attire in the public sphere, like Bill 21 here in Quebec, where religious freedom is being offered up on the altar of a kind of racial secularism. And Muslim women are denied the ability that other women have to be able to choose how they wish to dress in public because their niqab or their hijab are seen as signs of Islamic civilizational threat. And so Muslim women are bearing the brunt of a lot of various kinds of Islamophobia, both from the kinds of ideologies and recurring Orientalist tropes that are now becoming enshrined within various kinds of legislation. So that's my reflection on the 20 years and where we are at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmin. Ronnie.
Thanks so much. I'll go quick to the chase, but salam alaikum to everybody. Thanks for having me. I think, given my involvement in the South African struggle, it's necessary to draw that same parallel between what our colleagues have been referring to in terms of how Islam is used in the 21st century as the phobia, the bogeyman, just as communism was used in the previous century. And we saw this all over the Africa, Asia, Latin American struggles. And in Africa particularly, it was from Algeria, Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa. We were termed working and the surrogates of either Beijing or Moscow. We were going to bring the communists into Africa, and we were termed the terrorists. So Kenyatta and Neto and Samora Machel and Amilcar Cabral, Mandela were all called the terrorists. What's so important to remind ourselves of is that repression, the exploitation, the oppression, the denial of independence, that repression gives rise to national resistance. And as Karl Marx once famously talked of revolution, that it advances, the resistance of people advances against oppression. In turn, oppression intensifies. This gives rise to greater degree of resistance, and there's that cycle. And we saw that in the last century with the victories in all those continents of popular struggles, including the struggle of the Palestinian people. And we're seeing it again, actually, as we go into the 21st century. So the script of the Pentagon and US imperialism is not going to plan. The war on terror is not going according to plan. And the previous speaker has referred to the position that the Pentagon and the US administration took up post the collapse of the Soviet Union, and mentioned Paul Wolfowitz. So Wesley Clark, the general, had actually let the cat out of the bag at a certain stage. And he said that Wolfowitz told him, post the fall of the Soviet Union, it's so relevant to the war on terror that is obviously follows on the 9/11 attack. And he said that we've got to clean up certain of these pro-Soviet states, and there's 7, because if we don't clean them up, a new superpower, read Russia revived, and of course China, are going to come to the fore, and they're going to get a foot in. And who were the 7? Well, it was Iran and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon connected there in those days, and again now, and in Africa, Libya and the Sudan and Somalia. So talking then of the struggle, anti-imperialist struggle, and the struggle for humanity against imperialism, let's look at that script. And I would say, and of course, at terrible cost and suffering, and the millions that are affected and have died, but resistance and revolution for a just cause is not easily scripted out of the scenario. And in relation to this, what we have seen 20 years later, and of course, they're not the guerrillas of Samora Machel or Mandela or the Algerians and so on, but it's a resistance in Afghanistan for 20 years. It was the Taliban who was in power and had nothing to do with 9/11. And if we go through the dates, George Bush immediately declared war on Afghanistan and went after bin Laden. And this has led to the 20 years of dreadful repression and loss of life and resistance. And then very shortly after, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and the weapons of mass destruction was conjured up. And we know the fate there and the awful cost. But where is, as with Afghanistan today, where is the American position in Iraq? And if you take Lebanon, and let's bring in the Zionist factor, which the Chinese in the old days would have called the running dogs of imperialism. They're certainly a sub-imperialist power in the Middle East, placed there to keep the Middle East and oil under control of the West and the American empire, but the EU and so on. And in relation to the Lebanon and Israel, the 2006 war, and Hezbollah emerged out of that, and the axis of resistance in greater strength post that. And let's refer to our dear Palestinian friends and brothers and sisters who, despite the repeated attacks by Israel, supported to the hilt by the USA, up to just a few months before the latest departure of the United States out of Kabul and Afghanistan. I'm referring to the events of May and what Israel was trying to do in clearing out Judaization of East Jerusalem, how the resistance, and it wasn't just rockets from the jihadis and Hamas, but it was Palestinian resistance throughout. The 1948 Palestinians, the people of the West Bank, the people in Gaza, the Palestinians in the diaspora, and international solidarity. But the unity of the Palestinians, which has come to the fore. So we can see a big change. And of course, if we look at the calendar and we bear in mind Libya and what happened to Gaddafi because of NATO and the US war of terror, what's been happening in Somalia and now in Sudan, but with people's uprisings everywhere, Black Lives Matter, the resistance against imperialism, white supremacy, linking up, and people coming together in an anti-war, anti-imperialist coalition. I think we need to characterize the moment that way as well. And the defeat for imperialism, and the USA in particular, the loss of prestige, the loss of confidence and trust, because again, as with Vietnam, the scurrying out, the departure, leaving people in the lurch who they had corrupted and who were supporting them, is the Palestinian fate next, or the Israeli fate. This is going through the minds of American allies, supporters, proxies everywhere. And Central Asia, which is why Afghanistan is so important for the Middle East and the globe, is now no longer the preserve as it once was battled by the British. And that's why they were after Afghanistan and also lost many times. So the Central Asia opens up Iran, Beijing, Moscow, Qataris, Pakistan, and in terms of that, there's a great change. And therefore, as a revolutionary, we have to always project the hope and optimistic in a realistic sense. But I would say the script has gone against the American century, the deal of the century, the Abrahamic Accords. It's moving the other way because of people's resistance. And the lesson from 9/11 is to resist and to form anti-imperialist solidarity of all the forces, from Black Lives Matter, the anti-war movements of Europe and North America, to Africa, Asia, Latin America. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That's very inspiring. We have 6 more speakers in 30 minutes, just so you know. Rania is next.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm having difficulty hearing the other panelists, so my apologies, but I hope that you all could hear me. Greetings to you all from Beirut, Lebanon, one of the many, many countries in this world that has been regularly exposed to US bombardment and US destruction, either directly or indirectly. The question we were given in this round is, what is our relationship and our approach to 9/11 20 years ago? What was that relationship and where am I now? And how is 9/11 actually defined and how do we define it? And I'm going to try to answer those questions very briefly in 2 minutes. For me, the horror wasn't 9/11 itself, which I experienced back when I was living in North Carolina. For me, the horror was George W. Bush's speech. I found his speech to be completely horrific because here he was openly declaring, quote, forever wars. So it led me to question, whose other lives will be invisibilized or will be minimalized? You know, how many lives around the world are going to be set aside? Whose history will be disregarded? Whose revenge is considered to be acceptable? Is revenge only acceptable from the United States military, but revenge from everyone else is discounted and set aside? What I also found to be completely problematic is the way now, 20 years later, after that, the crime of 9/11 and the terrorist act committed by George W. Bush and committed by other leaders since, what I find to be really appalling is the way these 20 years have been presented. They have been presented as the forever wars, as if it is something new for the United States to be engaging in war. The United States has been at war with one country or another for 92% of its existence. So what would be uncommon would be for the United States not to invade and destroy and bomb and commit atrocities against other peoples of the world. So we need to put that within its historical context. You know, that these forever wars have been forever ongoing. This time, though, in these 20 years, the United States engaged in war against 80 countries at the same time and tremendously destroyed 8 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, and Libya. The 9/11 wars led to 38 million people being displaced and the death of up to 1 million people around the world. All of their lives have been dismissed, or at most, they get presented as a mere number. We have also seen over these past 20 years the expansion of the kind of warfare that the United States engages in. Now we have expansion of the privatization of war, where contractors are sent out, where we have a bigger marriage between the military-industrial complex and private businesses in the United States, and even deeper marriage than was previously. We also have seen the use of technology in an even more horrific way, with drones being used and being presented as clean warfare, as was even recently used in the most recent US crime against Afghanistan. But what we don't have recognized are the thousands upon thousands of civilians that have been killed by US drone warfare. Between 22,000 to 48,000 civilians have been killed in the 100,000 airstrikes committed by the United States in the more than 8 countries in which it massively engages in these airstrikes. So we need to contextualize this historically, contextualize it linguistically, and ask ourselves as activists, as academics, as individuals who respect human life, how are we going to take this forward? Will we continue to present this as Democrat versus Republican, whereas we know that in the United States, there's a one-party system and not a two-party system? Will we continue to present this as an aberration of US foreign policy that President Biden is stepping away from, rather than an escalation of US foreign policy, both domestically within the United States, where the United States has spent $32 million an hour, $32 million an hour on these wars. So we can also think about the direct and indirect cost on Americans with the expense of this war. How are we going to represent these past 20 years? And how are we going to look on it forward? Even now, the New York Times looks at these 20 years, and I'm quoting in the headline that they said today, I quote, they spoke of a success of a multilateral effort that extended to as many as 85 countries. We still have the New York Times touting what happened over the past 20 years. We still have mainstream agencies in the United States speaking about, oh, we weren't successful in imposing democracy and what's going to happen to the women that we leave behind in Afghanistan, as if the United States has ever been concerned about democracy overseas. And I would argue the United States has not even been concerned about democracy within the United States. So we have a great deal to work forward. I just want to leave with one more comment in the time that I have left. One thing that is particularly important to us, people of this region, people of the so-called Middle East, a term that is deeply problematic. One thing that is extremely important for us, Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians, Iraqis, is the way that we have been presented by the US media and the way that we have been presented in US academic books. We have been presented as an amalgamation of sects. We have been presented within the lens of religious identification, and this has been magnified over the past 20 years. And this has only led to massive destruction and massive division and an ahistoric representation of who we are. Because by representing people as their sectarian communities, it denies us the ability to represent them as they are truly, in their political sense, in their employment sense, in their academic sense, in their ideological sense, and fundamentally as people of the land. So I'm going to end it here. I know I'm a bit over time, and I apologize once again that I wasn't able to hear the other panelists, so I apologize if I repeated something that was said. I look forward to the many questions that are coming, and I hope that I'll be able to hear them. Greetings again from Lebanon.
Right, that's great. Fahd?
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings, folks. My name is Fahd. This is Nusaiba. She will probably be on for this panel. I want to speak as the perspective of an organizer in terms of what were impacts on the ground here in the New York area, and also the possibilities, the efforts for resistance and the possibilities that lay ahead. Immediately after 9/11, what we saw in the New York, New Jersey area was massive sweeps rounding up men who were perceived to be Muslim, and included non-Muslim men, who were picked up off of the street, off of their workplaces, out of their homes, and held in county jails in New Jersey, incommunicado. Some of them were not allowed to contact their families or their attorneys or anybody for up to 6 months or 8 months. And we were the first and probably the main organization that was working with these folks, working with about 400 of those detainees. The way we found out about these folks was we were getting calls on our hotline from wives saying, my husband, police came by last night and took my husband and my brother, I don't know where they are. Kids calling and saying that my father left for work 4 days ago and we don't know where he is. Coworkers calling and saying a black van just showed up and grabbed 3 guys and drove off with them. And about 1,200 men were picked up. 0 were found to have connections to any form of terrorism. A year after 9/11, a program was launched called Special Registrations, which asked men over the ages of 16 from, I think it was like 25 Muslim majority countries plus North Korea for the diversity factor to register with the government. Men lined up in the thousands outside of federal buildings in the US because of what their national background was. Lined up in the thousands. 83,000 registered, 13,000 were put into deportation proceedings. In this time, so there's the detention, the humiliation, the deportation of the men. But there's also families that are left without breadwinners. I counseled 14 and 15-year-old kids on whether they should drop out of school or not, so that they can, in order to be able to support their families. And these are the sorts of realities on the ground that were happening within our communities, which are very much left out of the narratives that get told. Because all of these programs produce zero results, by March or April of 2002, law enforcement had shifted to a community relations approach, where they wanted to work with community leaders to figure out how to best target the right people. And essentially what this was a entryway to do infiltration and surveillance into the community. As soon as community leaders opened their doors, despite being told by many of us not to do so, we had the creation of informants, of undercover officers, and which eventually led to entrapments. Because if you're spending all this money surveilling people and there's no terrorists to be found, then you got to create them. And so informants and undercovers would go in and incite vulnerable people within our communities, and as soon as they were incited, they would then arrest them and proclaim a terror bust. I think a couple of things I want to highlight is that the responses within our communities and within our movements, I think largely fell into three categories. One is people going quiet, just trying to lay low. We definitely, this is very clear in our communities, but it was also very true in our movements. Our movements were very strong. Movements for justice were very strong before 9/11. There was the anti-WTO protests. There was the World Conference Against Racism that was literally happening around the same time. And the momentum of all of these movements was undercut. A second dynamic that we saw, much more prevalently within the community, but also at times within our movements, was to wrap ourselves in the flag, to protect ourselves by declaring ourselves to be more American than the Americans themselves. And we see this in community leaders suggesting collaboration with law enforcement, encouraging people to join law enforcement, encouraging people to join the US military. But we also see this in our movements, where the immigrant rights movement talked about immigrants are not terrorists, so don't treat us like those people. Or people promoting versions of the DREAM Act, which included a military provision, and resisting critiques that joining the military should not be a pathway to citizenship. And then the third category are the people that resisted, whether within communities or within movements. And the last point I want to leave with is, within this last segment of resistance, there's multiple forms and methodologies that people take. Advocacy is important, legal work is important, community education and academia is important, services is important. All of these approaches are important, but none of them can substitute for what is needed, which is mass-based organizing, which not only gets to the root of the crisis that exists, but is the only approach that is capable of winning transformational change, because it is the only approach that develops the fighting forces that would lead us to confront the powers and the system as it is, and to be able to create a different system, a different world, the way that we would want it to be. So my closing call is the need to organize, organize, organize. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sami? You're muted.
don't see where I don't think I am.
Oh, yeah, you're good now. Yeah.
Oh, all right. I want to thank the organizers, particularly Rabab, for putting this panel together in this important time of our lives. When 9/11 happened, the American political establishment had to explain to the American people what had actually taken place. They only had two possible answers. Either the attacks happened because of our policies, which included at the time the occupation of the birthplace of Islam in Saudi Arabia after the Saddam invasion of Kuwait, the subsequent sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 people, because, in the words of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, it was worth it, or because of the full support and backing of successive US administrations to the state, the colonial settler state of Israel, providing it state-of-the-art military hardware, the economic subsidy to the tune of $200 billion over half a century, or political and diplomatic cover of 46 vetoes at the UN Security Council, or because of long-standing US policy of supporting dictatorships and totalitarian regimes in the Arab world, paying lip service to democracy while undermining it every step of the way, propping up thugs to rule over millions of Arabs. The other answer was that we were attacked because of our freedom, our democracy, of who we are. And because we can't change who we are, then we have to change who they are. And there it was. Invasions, occupations, setting up incompetent and corrupt regimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, detentions of tens of thousands of people, Gitmo and Abu Ghraib, torture, black sites, drones, bombings, assassinations, surveillance state, CVE programs, so that they can recruit thousands of informants, entrapment, criminalization of speech, securitization of American Muslims, and demonization of Islam and Muslims. What happened after 9/11, in the words of former FBI agent Terry Albury, which was revealed in last week actually in New York Times, important article that I advise and recommend everybody to read to understand or to get the evidence of all these policies. He said that political elites in America and the security state decided after 9/11 that not radicalization was the problem, but Islam is the enemy. In doing so, silencing Muslim leaders, undermining Muslim institutions, infiltrating Muslim communities, targeting the most vulnerable among them through entrapment and other tactics, just to name a few, became government standard policy. I was among the first Muslim leaders to be targeted in the US because of powerful interest groups that wanted to silence dissent and critics of American foreign as well as domestic policy, particularly with regards to Palestine, and as well as the abuses of civil rights like secret evidence, which were taking place before actually 9/11. These attempts had been taking place for years before the September 11 attacks, but 9/11 was the perfect pretext to fulfill that goal of eliminating my voice and ability to challenge the false narrative of imperialism and settler colonialism. 20 years later, it's clear that this policy has failed, and the explanation given to the American people has been exposed as false and a bunch of lies. There is little self-reflection 20 years after this, or self-criticism or regret of those who have taken these policies, whether it's the elites, policymakers, the media, what have you. of the death or destruction that has been taking place across the world, as some of my colleagues have pointed out, what America needs today is a massive grassroots movement to mobilize, organize, resist, and change, particularly among the communities that have been impacted and affected by this so-called global war on terror that we have seen just in the past few weeks, how it has been exposed and defeated. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa.
Thank you all. Well, in the decade before 9/11, I was spending all my intellectual time working on researching the Israeli military court system in the West Bank and Gaza, which made me something of an expert on torture. And one of the things about the Israeli situation that really foreshadowed what happened with the U.S. government after 9/11 was it is, well, you know, more governments than not utilized torture. Israel was the first government in the world to legalize it in 1987 by both narrowing what constituted torture and then arguing that coercive interrogation techniques could be legitimate because they were necessary to fight what the government regarded as hostile terrorist activities. And that legalization was done by government lawyers. After 9/11, individuals in the Bush administration who, you know, sort of the argument about how the war on terror was going to be waged, it really was a war for information, who perpetrated the 9/11 attacks, et cetera. And so capture, detention, and interrogation became the strategic centerpiece of the war on terror from the start. And it was, along with that, was the decision made by people who lacked any kind of expertise on interrogation or, you know, anything else. And I'm talking to you, Dick Cheney, were, you know, basically persuaded themselves that the only way to get information out of whoever was captured was through violent and coercive interrogation tactics. And so government lawyers, including one that Hatem Banian had mentioned, John Yoo, who was working in the Justice Department, now back at Berkeley teaching, you know, basically constructed legal rationales to enable U.S. torturers or U.S. interrogators to use torture without the fear of legal consequences. So that became, you know, the fact that people were just rounded up, not only in the United States with immigration sweeps, as other people have mentioned, but basically anybody who was captured for reasons of U.S. government policy came to be to be captured was to be suspicious, and to be a suspect was then to be rightless and therefore to be legitimately subjected to, you know, violent and coercive interrogation techniques in Bagram, in Guantanamo, and in the CIA black sites. Well, you know, the fact that the U.S. government relied on torture as the centerpiece for the war on terror for the first half dozen years, you know, there would have been no opposition to that because, first of all, it was classified. All these policies were classified, but also the mainstream American public, even as things started coming into, you know, public awareness through journalists and human rights reporting that torture was in fact happening, never galvanized a large-scale anti-torture movement in the U.S. The Abu Ghraib photos that were made public in April of 2004 was kind of a turning point. But what was significant about that turning point was that many U.S. lawyers, 600 some U.S. lawyers, joined with those first lawyers who had started fighting the Bush administration. And I'm referring to the late Michael Ratner and lawyers associated with the Center for Constitutional Rights, along with two death penalty lawyers, Joe Margulis and Clive Stafford Smith, who had started fighting incommunicado detention in the courts back in February of 2002. But it was the Abu Ghraib scandal which forced the Bush administration to release some documents which came to be seen referred to as the torture memos, where it became clear that torture was not just happenstance or, you know, bad apples or animals on the night shift as the immediate response to Abu Ghraib was framed, but rather was government policy. And so it was several fights that lawyers made against government policies that ultimately dry docked the torture program. And the paradox is that when torture was taken off the table, it made capture, undesirable because a sizable portion of the U.S. public liked the idea once it was revealed that the U.S. government was utilizing torture. And so in order to not continue sort of feeding the red meat to the public, it really just made capture impossible. And so in the last year of Bush's second term, targeted killing supplanted capture, interrogation, and detention as the cornerstone of the war on terror. And it was expanded vastly by President Obama. And here too, Israel played a role, because Israel became the first country in 2000 at the start of the second Intifada to legalize targeted killing. And so in some ways we see aspects of the war on terror, particularly the ways in which they've been legalized and legitimized by government lawyers, where Israel does it first, then the United States does it bigger. I'm just going to conclude, since we have, there's been so many people, but just to say that one of the ways, the lessons we can take away from this is that there have been no lessons learned by not either the U.S. government over subsequent administrations or the mainstream U.S. public, because to learn certain lessons about what was wrong, what went wrong, and who did wrong, since there's been no accountability, would require something that is unimaginable, which would be for the United States and its citizens to hold a harsh mirror to themselves and say, we made terrible mistakes and we must change. I don't see that happening, but I just conclude by saying that one of the things that defines my career, and which I always try to inspire my own students, is study and become an expert on the things you hate most, because that's one of the ways in which you can contribute to social change. Thank you.
That's great advice. Yazan is having problems, so Rabab will close us out.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to be very brief if I can. So first thing I want to say that to respond to the criticism, why so many people? And you all know I always like to have many people actually begin the conversation and then we continue it afterwards. But I also should say that many people actually would not speak on a topic of this sort. And I think this specifically speaks to the ways in which 9/11/2001 has been constructed, and probably speaks to the last point that Lisa mentioned, how it is sacred. It's supposed to be a sacred occasion that has never happened to anybody else. It's exceptional because it's happened to the US and so on. So I think one of our objectives was to challenge that nothing is taboo, nothing is sacred. We can speak about everything and anything and subject everything to inquiry. The second point that I wanted to mention is the question of, again, narratives. Which narratives have been silenced? And I was reminded a lot after 9/11/2001. I had just come back from 1 year in Cairo, and I had gone to, first time for a very long time, to Lebanon and started interviewing survivors of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, actually on the same day that Sharon was elected as Prime Minister of Israel, coincidentally. And then I took my students that summer to Beirut, and we also met with people, which actually was the first field trip I took my students on, and that led to the various delegations that we were organizing and so on. And then there were a lot of talk about the memorializing, commemorating who is being memorialized, who's not, who's being forgotten. But that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, as if it has never happened anywhere else and anywhere in the world. And so then the whole question of the navel gazing was coming up a lot, and the lack of lessons learned. The other aspect of it is that the September 11, 2001 took place a year after the Aqsa Intifada has started on September 28th, 2000, and when Israel was actually conducting a very aggressive attack against Palestinians, engaged in what they call targeted killing, which was justified also by the US, reinvasion of Palestinian cities, torture, the destruction, which I mentioned, of the Jenin camp, completely a massacre was taking place, which also relates, somebody was asking a question about the 6 Palestinian prisoners who escaped, 4 of whom have already been rearrested by Israel, but 2 are still free. As far as you can be free under conditions of colonialism and occupation. But that was completely erased. So when people talked about 9/11/2001 and the pain that the United States collective hegemonic, dominant narrative was doing, there was nothing else that could be talked about, but that also led to the US and Israeli justification of the securitized and the surveillance and the collaboration between the two. And I see a comment from Fahd about that, between the two, and the tactics, and actually including the point of the United States resorting to something like administrative detention, holding people without due process in secret evidence, which was some of the tactics that were applied against Dr. Sami Al-Arian, the Holy Land Fund, which was inherited from the case of the Los Angeles 8 case, in which they could just hold things, quote unquote, in camera, which was part of the United States re-strategy by George Herbert Bush when he was the vice president of Reagan, and the cover-up for the Iran-Contra affair and so on. The last point that I think is really important to think about is what constitutes legitimate knowledge then. Is a discussion of these things belonging in the classroom, or they are only supposed to be in activists on public spaces and so on, or in sort of cocktail parties whenever have time, people, or this is something about the discussion. And I remember clearly one of the early articles that came out, there was a lot, but one of them that was very clearly was by the art critic of the New York Times, Edward Rothstein, wrote 2 articles. One, he was attacking what he said, POCO, post-colonialism. The first one was POMO, postmodernism. He did this whole criticism and so on, and said this 9/11 basically divided, and he was approaching the Huntingtons, a clash of civilizations, and Wolfowitz and Bill Maher, and also the liberal establishment was sort of showing where it was at in terms of its Islamophobia, in terms of its Orientalism, in terms of its racism. And another article was against post-colonialism, which actually, if you want to look at it now, you go back to not long ago, Thomas Friedman wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times talking about criticizing specifically critical race theory and so on, and talking about what he labeled as Islamofascism, which was a term that was applied by Horowitz against activism on campuses and so on. But the question is, so what constitutes legitimate knowledge? What is the knowledge that we're allowed to speak in the classroom? What are the knowledges that we're not allowed to speak about? And not only within our communities, as Fahd was saying, who is silenced, who is not, who silences themselves, who is told by other gatekeepers of the community. And I really wish that Yazan was able to speak, because they would have actually talked about one of the projects of the countering violent extremism that was designed during the Obama administration, not even during the more right-wing things. So what does this mean about how do we think about gatekeeping? How do we think about knowledge? How do we think about the question of Arab, Muslim, Palestinian studies? What belongs in the discussion, in the curriculum, in scholarship? What is deemed as only for activists? And then you cannot be talking about it. How is it that we can actually bring in activists and critical public intellectuals together, which everybody here on this panel is. And the whole question also, what happened to the liberal establishment? So one of the main things that have happened post 9/11/2000, for example, was shift by somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who was one of the main liberal critics, collaborated with Edward Said in books and so on and so forth. And one of the first articles I remember, he was talking about the Phantom Towers. He basically talked about fascism and so on, and basically was developing the same lines that we hear again and again. So then the question becomes is that, what does it mean then today for what we can speak about? What is it that we cannot speak about? We're 20 years post 9/11/2001, and we still are kind of, and I would say myself too, weary about what do we say, what do we not say, how do we speak about it, in what ways can we actually discuss it, and what are the issues that can be brought together to speak about the securitization, to speak about the legitimization of quote unquote the war on terror, terrorism discourse, the increasing Islamophobia, the increasing Orientalism. But also I think one of the last questions that I would end with is the whole question that a lot of discussions post 9/11 2001 were raising, that now we have ethnic profiling that replaces racial profiling. And it was once again trying to actually engage in Olympics operation and say that, well, now there is no racism against other communities of color, it's now only Arabs and Muslims and so on. So on one hand, Arab and Muslim and Palestinian communities starts thinking that we are the exceptional victims, that we are the only victims and so on, because there is always has to be one victim. Flip the coin and decide who's the victim and who are the people who are victimized and who are the people who are able to speak. And then you have the rise of the native informants who come from our communities and start also weighing in and giving knowledge and so on, and are giving a lot of space in which is part of the industrialization industry of doing this kind of stuff. And the last point would be kind of like, so then what do we do if we are organic scholars that are committed to not only teaching and not only learning and not only researching, but we are really committed to a justice-centered perspective of knowledge production in which we want to change the world? How do we think about all of these questions? How does the question that we are now, they may not be learning lessons and they certainly not learning. Colonists never learn. They keep trying to repeat because it's arrogance of power again and again. But what do we do? What do we do as people who are producing knowledge, who believe is that the production of knowledge and changing the world go hand in hand, and we need to put the two together. So we are not legitimizing people who are in official academic places, legitimizing torture, or saying some people need to be shutting down and some narratives need to be invisibilized and erased. But how is it that we can also come together and actually provide the work, the collaboration, the dialectical interchange, and so on, in order for us to actually really produce a different kind of world according to the perspective of the indivisibility of justice? And I will stop.
Thanks so much, everybody. Dr. Kelley sends his regrets, but he had to go catch a flight right as we were ending. So thank you so much to him for moderating, and thank you to each and every one of the panelists for being with us and speaking today. With that, I think we're going to end the webinar right now. Again, thank you all so much. And yeah, goodbye.